we give people a couple more minutes, or do you think we should?
I think we should get started. It's on the nose, and I know people might be trickling in, but in fairness to the folks who have already made an effort to be on time, I think I'll just start with my introduction.
Great.
All right, my name is Carol Kowalski. I am Lexington's Assistant Town Manager for Development, and this is a meeting of stakeholders to gather input to be relayed to the Select Board when they hear this presentation at a Select Board meeting in October. The invitation went out to over 500 abutters and owners in the study area. It went to town meeting members, Lexington Housing, Historic, Economic, and Retail Committees, the Chamber of Commerce, the Financial Committees, and many others. Housing is a high priority of the Select Board, and town meeting has taken multiple actions in the last 2 years to support the dire need for housing affordability and variety in Lexington. This study came about in response to an opportunity presented by Senator Friedman for funding through a state ARPA budget earmark to address the question, could housing work on these town-owned sites? LDA Architects and Interiors was hired this spring and will present their preliminary findings this morning and on September 26th at 6:30 p.m. We'll compile comments from these two meetings for the Select Board. The final report is expected by the end of the year. This is the first of the two opportunities. The second one, as I said, is September 26th at 6:30 p.m. Both of these are on Zoom. Additional input can be emailed to housingstudy@lexingtonma.gov. I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to introduce Ragi Ramachandran, who is my administrative assistant and who happens to serve on the Affordable Housing Trust in the town where she lives. And I know that we also have our planning director, Abby McCabe, on the Zoom call in attendance. And now I'm going to ask Kim Barnett with LDA to introduce her team. Thank you to everyone for coming.
Thanks, Carol. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us first thing on this rainy morning. So on the call from the study team is myself. I'm Kim Barnett. I'm an architect and principal at LDA, and also Doug Dick, who is a fellow principal here with me, and Sarah Glassman, who is our director of marketing. She's going to be making sure all the tech works this morning for me. And then also a key person on the study team who's on the call this morning is Brett Pelletier from Kirk & Company. He is our real estate analyst and has all of the information about the finances that we're going to go through. And then you can see at the bottom of the screen there, the additional members of the study team, which include landscape architects, civil engineers, transportation engineers, and cost estimators. We have a pretty full agenda this morning, so I did want to run through it with you so you can kind of picture what we're going to try and get through. We're going to try really hard to have a hard stop at 11 o'clock and leave a lot of time for discussion in the second half of the meeting. So I'm going to do a brief overview of where we are in the big picture of the study. And then I'm also going to run you through the 3 sites that are part of this study, both the constraints that we found, opportunities for development, and then a very initial conceptual programming that we did for each site, looking at the most housing units we think we can fit on each site. And then Brett is going to run you through his initial analysis, which was looking at the housing needs in Lexington and the different models for how the housing might be met and the feasibility of those models given the conditions in Lexington. We had 4 questions that we're hoping you can think about while we're presenting, and then we're going to spend about 20 minutes trying to just focus on those 4 questions. This is really the goal today, is to help you guys or ask you guys to help us narrow in our focus a little bit. As you'll see from what I show and what Brett talks about, there's a lot of options out there. So understanding the priorities from the town and the stakeholders is really important. So as we're going through, if you can think about these questions, what should the priority be for the town on these sites in terms of housing? Which site do you think makes the most sense to put new housing on? And when we do put that housing on, is maximizing the goal, or should we be looking at a smaller scale development? And then finally, we know a very important issue that we need to get feedback on is parking, specifically in the town center. So we're going to run through those questions. We'll ask people to raise their hand and we'll unmute you to answer. We'll also have an opportunity to put your thoughts into the chat and to answer some polls that my colleague Sarah is going to post into the chat. So hopefully if we can't talk to you directly, you'll get an opportunity to share your thoughts in one of the other ways. And then at the last, hopefully 40 minutes or so, we're going to have an open discussion. And at that point, again, raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Or if you'd rather put your question into the Q&A, well, Sarah will be keeping an eye on that so we can try and address questions both ways. I would ask that because we have a lot to get through at the first half of the meeting, that you do hold your questions until the end, but certainly along the way, if something comes to you, feel free to drop it into the Q&A, and Sarah is going to be keeping track of those. So that's a lot to get through, so we're just going to jump right in. So where we are in the process, we've been working with Carol's team since May, and we're aiming to be done with this study in the end of December. So the first few weeks of the process was really information gathering. That included visiting the 3 sites, and the 3 sites are the depot lot, the lot behind 1701, 1751 Mass Ave, and then 171, 173 Bedford Street. And I'll show you images and maps of all of those if those don't come to mind immediately for you. We looked at things like zoning and the history of the sites and easements that might exist on the site, what utilities are on the site, and just collected as much information as we could from the documents the town had and our site visits to really put parameters around what kind of volume of development is possible on each of those sites. While the architects and landscape architects were working on that, Brett was doing a similar information gathering in terms of what housing exists in the town, what needs exist. And we had a great meeting to kind of review everything with Carol's team. And from there, once we felt like we had a good sense of both of those things, we moved on to conceptual planning. So an analysis on the feasibility of different types of development that Brett did. And on our end, looking at within the constraints of what's allowable on each site, what number of units is possible. I do want to emphasize that what we're going to show today is not a design, it's just a concept. So it's basically the amount of space we can occupy based off of zoning and other site restrictions, and how many units that yields. So I know it's easy to jump right into what is it going to look like, and we're not there yet. So this is really to gain feedback so that when we move to the next step, which will be trying to give it a bit of a form, both in terms of how we're structuring the development for affordability, but also what the potential, development might look like. That is the next step. That is definitely not where we are now. So I just want to make that clear so nobody starts to worry that the boxes I'm showing are in any way a proposed design. So just to keep going, this is just the big schedule we're following. You can see all the times we've met with Carol's team, and here we are, the 2 stakeholder meetings today and on the 26th. And then as Carol mentioned, we will be going to have a meeting with the select board sometime in October, which is not set yet as far as I know. So this is really great. This is helpful that it's coming first. So I want to jump into the three sites. As I mentioned, the depot lot is what we've been calling Site A. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. It is right in town center. It is behind, along the bikeway here. It's sort of, we've been calling it a needle-shaped site. It's a very interesting long and thin site. And of course, it does have the historic depot building as one of its immediate neighbors. It's a little over 2.5 acres. It's in the central business district, and it does have a multifamily overlay district on it. And it is partially in the Battle Green Historic District. Given all of that, there's a max building height of 52 feet, which we interpret as 4 stories. And of course, as you know, center of town, it has great access to public amenities, obviously the bikeway being one of the best amenities running through this site. It does, however, have a lot of challenges. This site probably has the most restrictions on it of the 3. Some of the key ones, and ones that we're going to talk about later in the questions and answers, is parking. So we were tasked with trying to keep the 300 existing parking spots that are there because they're so highly used. And in our site exploration, we are also discovered that there is an MCD sewer easement that runs the entire length of the site. So that is an area that we cannot build over. And that does restrict a lot of where a building could go on the site. We also just determined in our historic research that this pedestrian connection here through the site, which is currently a crosswalk, which in the past has been a bridge, that's something we felt was important to consider in the development of the site. This parking lot also is where the tour buses currently turn around. And while that's not absolutely a mandate to keep, we do think that we should consider it in any kind of development here. And then finally, again, in our historic research, we determined that, there is the potential that this soil might need to be moved off site during a development because of its former use as a rail yard. So that's something more to think about in terms of cost of development. But in a town like Lexington, where it's historic, it's not unusual that something like that would be the case. So that is sort of the context of the depot lot. I'm going to run through the other lots and then circle back to what the development options we've considered are. The second lot is the lot behind 1701, 1751 Mass Ave. This site is significantly smaller. It's only about 3/4 of an acre. It is in the same zoning district, though, multifamily overlay district. So it has the same site characteristics in terms of height and access. It does also have quite a few of its own constraints. I'm going to just zoom in for a minute here. So it's a small site already, but there's a lot of circulation and access needed to its neighbors that it's important to maintain, and really does limit the available building area on the site. So while the property line is the red line, this orange zone is an easement that exists for the access to the rear of these buildings. And then all of the blue arrows you see are all of the existing building entries of the neighbors. So in what is already a pretty tight site, there's a lot of considerations for the edges. And it is a pretty small buildable area once all of that is taken into consideration. And then finally, the Bedford Street site, 171, 173 Bedford, is our third site in the study. This again is about 2 3/4 acres. It is in the central local office district with a village overlay. So this one has 2 options in terms of the max building height. If there is no first floor commercial space, it's a 40-foot max building height. If there is a first floor commercial space, it's 60 feet. So that is basically 3 stories or 5 stories in terms of what we've been looking at. The nice thing about this site is the parking is not part of the requirement to keep it as public parking. So there is sort of a little bit more freedom in terms of how we use the site, as it's currently used for the police department, no, fire department, one of the two. And I know it's been both in the history of the site. And the town has plans to use it as swing space for several different departments up until about 2031. So the constraint on this site, the biggest constraint is not the dimensional constraints like on the other, but actually that time constraint that any development here really would be quite a few years out. And so, you know, that's something to keep in mind. Okay. So how did we look at these sites and think about what can fit onto each of them? As I mentioned, this first pass at programming really was looking at what's the maximum reasonable number of units we thought could fit on each site. What I'm going to show is that maximum. Obviously, there's always the ability to do less, but we thought by starting with the maximum, that gives us the best starting point for the study. We did make a couple assumptions in terms of building construction, sizes of things. And one of the things we did do at this initial stage was assume that the housing has an equal distribution of 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedrooms. And Brett's going to talk a little bit more about that. And that's probably something that's going to shift over the course of the study to be a little bit more reflective of the actual demographics of need in the town. But that was our starting point. And we also were just looking at the most efficient structure to start from. So that is basically a double loaded corridor. So you have a hallway in the middle and units on each side. And that was our starting point for these very simple programmatic diagrams that we put together. And the goal is, you know, what is the maximum unit count that is reasonable on each site? And we want to, in this study initial phase, reduce kind of any zoning bylaw relief we would be asking for. So if the zoning district requires retail, then we provided retail. You know, we tried to follow the spacing of trees in the parking lot the zoning requires. So we're really kind of basing that off as our starting point. So this is the very complicated depot lot. As I mentioned, there's a lot of things still happening here. There's still our zoning easement, our sewer easement. There's still our tour bus turnaround. And really what that means is that we're really thinking that the northwest corner or the northern border of this site has the most possibility for a building. Given where the sewer easement is, all of this existing surface parking really makes sense to leave alone, although we would enhance it with trees. We would advocate that, you know, this lot doesn't currently follow the tree ordinance for parking, so we would encourage the development to incorporate that. But really the buildable footprint is here. And this parking restriction, so trying to maintain 300 parking spots here, obviously, as soon as you put a building down, that means you've taken away parking spots. So in order to keep them, we have to go either up and build structured parking up, or we have to go down and build structured parking down. And we really think that going up doesn't make a lot of sense, because every time you go up, the amount of units gets reduced. So while we're trying to hit the 300 parking spots, we think we need to go to structured parking below ground, and we need to add the 1 parking spot per every unit. So while the current lot had 300 spots, we're aiming for 300 plus the number of units. So it's kind of this balancing equation of math. And this zoning district also does require a first floor commercial, being that it's in the town center. So when we take all of that into consideration, what we're proposing here and what we think makes the most sense for the buildable area of this site is to put commercial on the first floor. Given the historic character of the depot, we wanted to provide some extra space around it, so it wouldn't have parking right next to it or building right next to it. So locating the commercial space adjacent to that seemed like a reasonable approach. And then really the rest of the first floor is either surface parking, as I mentioned, or it's parking under the building on the first floor. As I mentioned, we'd have to go down. So this is a basement level, and would need to be 3 levels below ground to meet the number of parking spaces that we're trying to aim for on this site, and stay clear of the sewer easement. And then we finally get to the housing, which would then be on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors above the retail on the 1st floor and the surface parking. And all of those things taken together, the restriction of where we are on the site, the need for parking, the need for retail, we think that this site could fit between 55 and 65 units. In the kind of way that I've described it there. So of the 3 sites that we're going to look at, it has the most restrictions on it, but it yields a really decent amount of units. The kind of middle size of the 3 sites that we're going to look at. The 1701, 1751 Mass Ave, I already sort of ran through the challenges here in terms of circulation. So we're staying away from our neighbors who have truck deliveries, away from the back of this building, which has a lot of pedestrian access, and we're still trying to maintain as much parking as we can. So the footprint of this building gets pretty small. We do have a little bit of street level commercial that we want to fit in because of the zoning district. But it does really limit where the building can go in the middle of this site. So given the odd shape of the site, going down for additional parking really doesn't make sense here. You would basically just be constantly turning and turning. It's not a great footprint for a parking garage. So here, what we're showing is that retail on the 1st floor and then units above, and we think we can fit 15 to 25 units. But actually, we have not managed yet in this study to figure out a way to keep all 56 parking spots. So one of the points that I'm hoping we can talk about at the end is if this site remains feasible in the study, is there another location where we can add some additional town parking spots to make the delta up? And then finally, and I'm trying to go kind of quick so we can get to Brett's information, is the Bedford Street lot. And as I mentioned here, the biggest challenge here is really just time. And in terms of space, this site offers a lot more flexibility in terms of buildable area. So this site yields the largest number of units, between 90 and 100. There are still zoning restrictions to include commercial. So we have done that. And it makes sense to us that we would recommend those be towards the Bedford Street side. I know there is some retail already being developed across the street. And then this site sort of has 2 sides to its character. There is the other commercial and professional spaces on one side, which already have a lot of pavement and drive. So we would recommend, trying to put the pavement and drive along that side here. And then there's the residential neighbors on the other side. And so we would try to keep all of the green space closer to them, so that there is not parking right adjacent to that side of the lot. And while we could have one solid building for this whole site, we really don't think that's a livable kind of community. So we are recommending breaking up the housing into 4 separate masses here. So that's why I'm calling it sort of the most reasonable maximum unit count. If we really tried, could we get a couple more here? We could, but it wouldn't then, I think, be a very lovely place to live, which is what we're also trying to accommodate. So on this site, we have the retail, like I said, towards Bedford Street, and then 2 strictly housing masses into the depth of the site. And then once we get above the ground floor level, it is housing for all 3 masses. We are recommending, because this site can go from 3 stories to 5 stories, given the character of the road, it might make sense to keep it at 3 stories towards Bedford Street and only let the buildings at the back of the site be the 5 stories. So that was a lot to go through, and we can circle back to all of it when we get to our discussion section. But just to summarize, depot lot, we think 55 to 65 units. We have managed with the underground parking to see a way to maintain the current public parking plus the parking for the residences and a commercial space. The lot in the 1701, 1751, there are, we think, 15 to 25 units, and it is a challenge right now to figure out how to keep all of that parking. So there is that open question of whether there's an opportunity for public parking somewhere else. And then finally, the Bedford Street lot is the biggest opportunity for housing units, 90 to 100. And that has parking for itself. Each unit has 1, and then the commercial parking spaces. So that is the big picture on the sites. Now Brett's going to do the big picture on the housing analysis, and then we'll looking forward to comments and discussion.
Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to basically do a quick rundown of housing needs and then some terms of the art, so we're all on the same page. And then I'll go into the basic assumptions of our economic analysis. I'm happy to answer questions at the end. I know most of you probably are going to get glossy-eyed and have a cup of coffee while I'm talking, but I'm totally fine with that. I'm accustomed to that. Basically, in sort of a sentence, it's no secret that there is a housing shortage and a housing crisis across the Commonwealth. And so in a sentence, there is need at every level or every cohort within the community. But what we're trying to do is narrow in onto a specific set of demographics and populations and unit types to try and refine our analysis. So we're providing sort of the most bang for the buck and the most benefit. And I'll just give you a quick rundown. Back one slide, sorry. Yeah, so quick rundown of a couple of these bullet points. About a third of the households within the town fall within a 30% of area median income and 120% of area median income. And area median income is just the statistical average, or median rather, of the incomes within the region. And so think about 100% median income being sort of the benchmark. Folks earning less than 100% are below that median, and folks earning above. In a particularly high cost and high income community, it's not unreasonable to assume that folks earning above the median are also a candidate or a possibility for consideration in housing. And so a third of the residents in the community are in that kind of 30 to 120 spot. If you look under 30, that's what we call, sort of extremely low income. There's an additional population there. So there's a significant population that is in need of consideration. Add that sort of demand function to the supply of most of Lexington's housing was built before 2000, so it's an older stock. Most of it is fully detached single family homes. And so that presents a challenge for affordability. About 10, you have met your 10% threshold. I think you're just under 11% according to the state for affordable, big A, capital A, affordable, permanently affordable housing. Statistically speaking, as it turns out, when you weed through that data, about half of those units are market rate rental units. Under the state rules, if you meet a certain threshold in any individual project, say you build 100 units of apartments and 25 of them are earmarked as affordable, you get credit for all 100. So while, yes, you've got 11% of your units as affordable, actually it's more like 5% probably, because a lot of those units in those larger buildings that were done under 40B years ago or whatever program count towards that inventory. And so about 34% of all of the households in the community are burdened by their housing costs. So that's almost 50% of renters in the community and 30% of homeowners. And basically that means they're spending 30% or more of their income to go towards housing costs. Okay, so all of that kind of combined makes the foundation of how we analyze or how we think about opportunities and options for the site. Next slide, please. So these are, I spoke about some of these already, but I want to go into a little bit more detail in case I have a tendency to talk fast sometimes and use abbreviations in a lot of our slides, but we want to make sure all of you understand some of these basic terms. So that 10% affordable threshold that I spoke of is the state's requirement under Chapter 40B, right? And that is, we call those SHI units. They're subsidized housing inventory. Those are the official affordable units that are cataloged and recorded by the state. Area median income, or AMI, is shorthand for talking about which income cohort a particular housing option fits. I said we were looking at between 30 and 120% of AMI, but there are thresholds that the state and the federal government use to describe each of those. Those thresholds typically are 30% of AMI, 50%, 60%, and 80% as affordable, and then 100%, 120 for what is often called workforce housing. The 60% of area median income threshold is the sort of benchmark for the low income housing tax credit program, which is a federal and a state. Massachusetts has their own LIHTC program for providing affordable housing. It is the largest production method of providing or financing housing for affordable housing. And so that's the 60% AMI level. So that's a sort of a benchmark. And then the housing cost burden, which I mentioned briefly, is a standard. If we in the business and the federal government says, if you spend more than 30% of your income towards housing, you are burdened. You're cost burdened by that housing. If you spend more than half of your income on housing, you are severely cost burdened. And so that was that 34% of residents or households in Lexington that were cost burdened. They're paying more than 30% of their income, and almost 50% of all renter households are paying more than 30%. That matters very much because you basically have 70% of your income to pay for everything else: transportation, food, medicine, all the things that we need to live and exist as functional members of the community. And so when we start eating away that number, it's a real burden on people's finances. So we have to narrow in of all of the sort of universe of potential affordable housing or mixed income housing, for sale, rental, senior, family. There's kind of an unlimited possibility for each of these sites. We have to sort of narrow them down as a first pass. And what we've done is tried to look at 4 basic quadrants. Is this 100% affordable housing? Is this a mixed income model? That's one sort of choice, decision tree. Is this a rental model, or is this an ownership model? And that's the other decision tree. And so add those 2 decision trees together, you get a bunch of different potential options within that mix. And so what we're looking at for sort of dedicated affordable housing is either 100% affordable housing or a majority of affordable housing with some small percentage of either market rate or workforce housing or some other housing. And generally that fits within the market in a bucket, right? There are dedicated affordable housing developers, both for-profit and nonprofit. There are financing sources and capital subsidies and operating subsidies that finance that help to make that feasible, whether those are low-income housing tax credits or reduced cost of capital or other mechanisms, vouchers and things like that. A mixed income model, which we would kind of categorize as either, you know, the typical 40B style model where 80 or 75% of the units are market rate. So it's predominantly a market rate project, and 20 to 25% of those units are reserved as affordable, typically at 80% of AMI. That's the 40B. So the dedicated affordable housing is the typical low-income housing tax credit model. And the mixed income model, we start at the 40B model and kind of work our way inward from 100% affordable to mostly market. And we test a model that is a traditional sort of purely mixed income with income cohorts kind of all over the place. Additionally, we look at whether it's rental or ownership. And from our conversations early on, ownership is always very difficult to do. There just are far fewer subsidies available to build affordable ownership, you know, condos or single family homes than for rental. There just isn't the same structure available in Massachusetts to finance those things. So while we look at them all, there are some obvious things that float to the top as we go through this economic analysis. So the first thing we do is build a simplified model. And so what we did was we looked at, okay, middle of the road, let's say a 45 units. It's easy to split up into 1s, 2s, and 3s. The initial guidance was, let's just do a third, a third, a third. We'll see how that pans out. We test the market as well. And the market actually tells us that there's in the inventory, there's about a quarter 1-bedrooms, about 56% 2-bedrooms, and only about 20% 3-bedrooms in the rental market currently. So that gives us a nice way to refine. Additionally, the QAP, which is the Qualified Allocation Plan, basically the document that guides the low-income housing tax credit application process, requires at least 65% 2 or more bedrooms and at least 10% reserved as 3-bedrooms for those projects to provide housing for families. And so there's a logical, and we've had some guidance as well from the town's housing consultant to say, really 1-bedrooms and 3-bedrooms are the most in demand currently from the advice that they've given us. And so we take that model, we build a simple paper model, electronic model, based on basic construction costs that we assume today, basic rates, operating expenses, and rates of return, and all those sorts of things to try and understand what the feasibility gap is. And basically what I'm always doing is, it's a bit of a pessimistic model, but what it does is it identifies a hole. You know, if you're renting at much less than what you could get in the market, you're not going to be able to pay for as much stuff to build, right? And so what you end up having to do is fill that hole with subsidy. And there's a general, we can look at what that hole is on an absolute and a per unit basis and make a quick and dirty assumption based on our quick and dirty model, whether or not we can fill that. If if it costs us $500,000 per unit to build and there's a $490,000 hole, that's a bridge too far, right? We're not going to be able to fill that hole with subsidy. So we have to make sure we understand the scale of what we're trying to do. So this is our basic first step operating model. And what I always do is I do what I call a feasibility rent, basically, or a market break-even rent. If I had to go out and buy land and pay a contractor to build my property, my project, and I was going to pull some profit and overhead out of it, and I could sell it at the end of the day at the market prevailing capitalization rates or the profit yields, what would I have to generate in a monthly rent in order to make that work? And that number comes in just over $500,000 a unit of total development costs based on some very preliminary understanding. And we kind of ignored the unique characteristics of each site and sort of smushed them all together and assumed we have a baseline. We will refine that once we get our cost estimates and we do some light engineering work. But basically we say it's, best guess is somewhere in the $500,000 a unit you could probably develop this property for. How much do I have to generate in rent, market rent, to make that work? And that number is about $4,000 a month per unit. And when we go into the market, we see that the current market in Lexington, sort of averaged out, broad brush, your studio's at $2,000 all the way up to a 3-bedroom at $4,000. There's some new product that has come on the market and is coming on the market in some adjacent communities that's pushing that number up a little bit. They're doing $4,500 a month on 3 bedrooms. So while it's tight, it's probably doable. It's still a little bit below where you'd have significant comfort. Construction costs are high, interest rates are high, and yields are kind of coming down. Cap rates are going up. So there's a strange market right now. It makes it very expensive. But basically, if you could get this built, you would have to find enough households making $160,000 a year in order to support that. And so well outside of the range of what most people would consider affordable to working individuals and families. So we basically build this out based on that assumption of we have the market rents where they are today, and to find our feasibility gap. This is our sort of first pass. This is a 45-unit market rate property on paper, 15 units 1, 15 units 2, 15 units 3-bedroom at the stated market rents. We assume a vacancy rate of 5%, which is standard, gets us to an income of about $1.7 million for the year. We take a 5% management fee off of that. We adjust about 30% for operating expenses. We take a $350 per unit per year reserve replacement for, changing fixtures and fittings and things like that. And we get a net operating income of about $1 million. If we capitalize that at prevailing cap rates, we get a value of about $17.5 million compared to a $23 million construction cost. So we've got a gap. Unless you can get rents that are on average, and we look at what that average would be of $4,000, that would basically have to be a 2-bedroom in this scenario. You'd have to get about $1,000 more per 2-bedroom per month than what is standard in the market. So that's just a test of feasibility of sort of the economic conditions today. Then we layer on top of that our affordability restrictions, and I'll go through those now, and I may not go through every single one, but this is our typical low-income housing tax credit model. We're building 45 units. All 45 of those units are restricted to families and individuals earning less than 60% of the area median income. The rents are calculated by a formula. They're published by HUD. They are stated there. Those are the maximum rents that are allowed under the low-income housing tax credit program. We do the same thing. We take a vacancy and collection loss of 5%. We take an operating expense, a management fee of 5%. The operating expenses are a higher percentage, but they're generally lower on a per unit basis for affordable housing because you're able to generate less income. So the expenses are a larger proportion of that income. And the same thing for reserves, et cetera. And we get down to a total development cost, same basic development program, about $23 million, about $507,000 a unit. We capitalize the income that we get, which is about half of what it was under the market rate scenario, which is about $550,000. And we get a financeable value of about $8.5 million. So that's a big gap. We've got a $14.5 million gap. That's $321,000 a unit. But fear not, this is where our capital subsidy comes into place. There's a potential for federal low-income housing tax credits and state low-income housing tax credits that gets us a maximum of $250,000 a unit. So that's a little over $11.25 million. We can support a mortgage based on our $8.5 million value. We can actually get a mortgage about $6.5 million. And so that's another $150,000 a unit. So now we have a funding gap of just about $110,000, which is a bridgeable gap, right? We have lots of opportunities to layer on subsidy, whether those are home funds, affordable housing trust funds, CPA funds, local sources, donated land, et cetera, et cetera. You know, one of the things you always consider when you're doing 100% affordable housing is your land basis. Under this assumption, we have assumed $35,000 per unit in land, which is less than probably what it would cost you to buy in the market, but we know the land has some constraints to it, right? There may be some subsoil conditions. It's going to be expensive to build underground parking, et cetera. And so if the community thought it was wise to provide low cost or free land to this effort, you already eliminate $35,000 of that extra cost. So now you're down to, you know, $70,000, give or take, of a gap. And you start to layer on subsidies. I've never been involved with a project, affordable housing project in Massachusetts that used any less than about 10 subsidy sources or capital sources. It's incredibly common, right? And so I think $109,000 is not an unreasonable gap to fill on the LIHTC model. This model is the typical 40B model. I won't go through all of the assumptions. They're exactly the same, but except we have 25% of the units rented at 80% of area median income, and the rest, 75%, rented at market rates. And we took the market rates and sort of projected into the future a little bit, and so we get a little bit higher market rates based on a project that is currently going through the hopper in a town very similar to this, and the rents are a little bit higher. Do the same exact bit of math with operating expenses and come down to the same kind of assumption. The funding gap, because you're able to rent a significant portion of those units at market, is more or less about 79,000. You can ignore all of the sources of capital, that pink box below. That doesn't get us. There are no low-income housing tax credits for that. I should have cut that out of the slide, but I apologize for the confusion. But you've got a funding gap of about $78,000. It's substantial, but it's not prohibitive. There's certainly ways to cost engineer that, and hope the market increases and hope the interest rates come down a little bit. We're looking today when we know that something is going to happen in 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And so not an unreasonable gap to fill. Here's where things start to get a little bit messy. This is what I'm calling the true mixed income model. We have a quarter of the project rented at 60% of AMI, a quarter rented at 80% of AMI, a quarter rented at 100% of AMI, and a quarter rented at market rate. The gap becomes much larger, and the offset the challenge is that there is very little offset, right? There are some programs that will fill smaller gaps, but you don't get access to the low-income housing tax credit program because you don't have you need at least 40% of your units to be affordable at 60% of AMI to get tax credits. We don't have that. We've only got 25%, so we don't get any tax credits. We get very little benefit from the market rate units because there is such a small percentage of the overall project, and it just becomes much more challenging to fill that gap. And so you've got a $160,000 funding gap, and there just are fewer subsidies available to fill that gap. And so the guidance typically is mixed income models can work, but they work organically and they work as a function of the resources that are available. And if you restrict too much your options and say, well, this is exactly what we want a quarter at 20, at 60%, we want a quarter at, then by the time this goes through the funding process and the approval process, those resources may no longer be available. The state may have changed its priority, the town may have changed its priority, and it becomes you end up having to retrade and renegotiate the set asides because it becomes functionally infeasible to do. And so while it's an option, it's a little bit harder to pinpoint. Okay, so this is the affordable ownership model. Basically, we built another similar market rate feasibility, and we look and say, great, if you want to build market rate condos, you can, even a very modest, we basically built what we built in the rental side of things. This is probably not what the market would build. It would build high luxury, much higher price point luxury units. But if you built a modest unit, could you make it work? And the answer is yes. The challenge is the costs associated, and this is the orange and white table below. You're restricted by how much you can charge for each of these units. And we've gotten the Regional Housing Service Organization to send us their calculations on those prices for 1s, 2s, and 3s at 80, 100, and 120% of AMI. And in sort of no case does the sales price cover the construction costs, right? And in most cases, it's pretty significant, except for maybe the 120% of AMI. And so maybe there are some small subsidies or some cost savings or some donated land or some other opportunities to make that work. But there is a significant funding gap at every stage for the affordable units. And the challenge too is anything below 80% of AMI on an ownership unit puts additional strain on households typically. And when having conversations about 50 or 60% of AMI home ownership units, it's a challenge, right? Because you should pay no more than about 30% of your income towards those housing costs. And if you're only making 50 or 60% of the median income, there isn't a ton left over for maintenance and repairs and taxes and homeowners insurance and all the other things that go along with home ownership. That is a challenge. And then you also have food and transportation and medicine and all the other sort of everyday living costs. And so each one of these has a feasibility gap. We can go to the next slide.
Pausing for just a moment, Kim's
computer just crashed, so
Uh-oh.
we are,
Can you open it? It's on the P drive.
yes, give us one moment. I'm going to open the file myself. Sorry about that.
In the meantime, I'll talk about an error I just noticed in my slide, which I will confess to you all. I've fat fingered the 3-bedroom 80% affordable sales price. That should be $285,000, not $385,000. And so the gap is you know, $324,000, not $224,000. So made it even worse. But
Okay.
oh, there we are.
I'd also like to take a second to say that we have elected officials on the call today, which is very nice of you all. It's Joe Pato, the chair of our select board, is with us, and planning board members Bob Creech and Charles Hornick are with us today.
Sorry, guys. Just a second.
And again, I sort of blasted through that. The slides presumably will be available, and you know, our final report will have very detailed descriptions of all of these exercises. But I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A as well.
Okay, sorry, Brett. Which slide did we land on?
We basically concluded with the first home ownership slide, and these are just backup for that slide, but it's a feasibility gap at every single step of the way, unless you layer in significant amounts of market rate units. So I don't think we need to go through each individual scenario.
Okay. So we'll just run to the summary page.
That's fine. Basically, on the rental side, the affordable units, there's a gap, but it's bridgeable. Same thing with the sort of 40B style project. The mixed income is trickier. It's doable, but it's more difficult from a public policy standpoint to in advance say we want a quarter at 30% of AMI, 10% at 50% AMI, because it's just harder to pinpoint where those funding sources will come from in the future. On the ownership model, it really sort of falls apart unless you can have a significant amount of market rate units to internally subsidize. And so, you know, you really have to have basically 75% affordable and 25%, 75% market rate and 25% affordable, just to make it sort of pencil out. And so when you compare that to the rental side of things, there's just certainly more opportunities to provide housing on the rental side. Potentially a component of a larger strategy for housing, but an entire project of affordable for sale condominiums is a real challenge in the market.
Sorry, I'm back now. Raggy, could you make me a host again so we can get back on track? And then this is a good point. We're pausing and we're about to head into our question phase. So if we get ourselves reset up, we'll get back on track here.
All right, you're all set, Kim.
All right, I'm back. That's just a little like jump up your blood pressure for the morning. Sorry, 1 second. Thanks everybody for your patience. Okay. All right, we did it. And did you make me a co-host again, Maggie?
Yes, I did.
Okay, all right. Woof. So I'm sharing my screen again, right? Yes, great. Thanks, everybody. So that was obviously a really quick run through of quite a few months of work and several meetings. and we definitely want to hear what all of you are thinking. So we thought maybe just to kick off the discussion and question section, we could ask you to maybe specifically answer a few questions that we have. So there were 4 that I mentioned when we started out. And then we will definitely open it up to broader comments and everything, because we know that there's certainly things on your mind that we might not have gotten to yet. If anybody has thoughts on this first question, we'd love for you to raise your hands. The question is, given everything that you know already and things that you heard today from Brett and I, what do you think should be the priority of the town for these sites? Some things that we're trying to figure out is it 100% affordable, or is it mixed affordable and market rate units? And then within either of those, would mixed use with ground floor retail also be a priority? And here on the bottom of the screen, I've just listed those same summary financial gaps that Brett was talking through earlier. Would love anyone who might want to respond to this to raise their hand. And then also Sarah's going to put in the chat a link to a poll. So if you'd rather provide your feedback that way, we will be reviewing answers from the poll later on after the meeting and summarizing them with our notes. Might have. Oh, thanks, David. I see your hand is up. And Sarah's asked you to unmute, so you should be able to do that in a minute.
Yes, David Cantor.
Hi, David.
It seems like we've lost the availability, feasibility of the 3 potential locations, and it isn't clear to me, because I'm not sophisticated enough, how does all of this funding issue relate to which, if any, has to be more than any, I guess, which of the 3 locations can accommodate what you've been describing as alternatives for costs related to some number of units like 44. How did we lose the discussion of where can it be done?
Sure, that's a great question. So that is definitely an open discussion question. And Brett and I are coming at it from 2 directions. And right now we're trying to mix those 2 together and understand, when we do mix them together, how to balance the priorities. So one thing that is on our list to do in the next stage is to provide Brett with development costs specific to each site. His models have been based off of historical data and have treated all 3 sites similarly. But as I mentioned, some sites had more constraints than others, the biggest of which perhaps being the structured below ground parking, which changed the cost to develop the depot lot. So that's definitely in our next step, is to put the actual construction cost estimates into Brett's analysis to help to weigh them based off of the site. I think we don't have it yet, but it certainly is a next step. And none of these questions are meant to be more or less important than the other. They're just in the order we put them in.
And two important things to note. The economic model is scalable. I picked 45 units because we're looking at a small site, a big site, and a middle-sized site. And I thought 45 units is an easy sort of first pass. We can scale that up to 100 units, and that becomes a more efficient property. It's cheaper on a per unit or per square foot basis because we can amortize large costs over a larger number of units. And it'll become slightly more expensive on a per unit basis for a smaller project typically. So the scale is fluid, and we can make that look however we want. That what Kim said is absolutely correct. That the next step is refining each of those, refining that model to a site-specific model, because we know there are things that exist on the depot lot that don't exist on the other lots. There are challenges with parking and circulation and easements and rights of way and things like that. And we also know that our largest site is occupied currently, right, and will be for some time, and so that factors into our consideration for feasibility on that site as well.
Well, I think maybe I'll move on then, because I think, David, your question really is keyed exactly to what our next question had been, which is, you know, which site is best suited for the affordable housing? Certainly, we don't know the answer to this yet, so we're not really expecting that you will, but we expect that you might have some opinions on it, and would love to hear if anybody does. Sarah, again, is posting a link to a poll if you'd like to provide your feedback that way.
Perhaps this is a good opportunity. Now we've got all of them. There was a question early on in the Q&A about whether or not we considered connecting Depot and the lot behind 1751 Mass Ave with an air rights arrangement to make those two sites one and make some, you know, shared utility or efficiency. I don't know if you want to answer that from the architect's perspective, and I can answer that from the real estate perspective.
We certainly, I think it's an interesting idea. You know, both of those lots, as I mentioned, have a lot of constraints on them. So giving either lot flexibility by being connected to the other could be beneficial. There's, you know, logistical challenges in terms of the Edison Way, which is a road that, you know, bisects this parking lot. It's also a road that is heavily used to, not heavily, that is relied upon by the deliveries to the Mass Ave buildings here. So definitely a physical connection would have to keep that in mind. More so, we actually were thinking with regard to the smaller of the two lots and the challenges of getting parking there, would some sort of additional structured parking on Depot be a balance to that smaller lot? Or the other way around, you know, to reduce the amount of underground parking on Depot, could we provide above ground structured parking on the 1751 Mass Ave lot? So I think that's a really good question. I guess if we were to consider that more, we would probably talk to the town about how they felt about, you know, two lots being part of the development consideration. And Brett, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I would just say that, you know, we didn't formally discuss it, but in my preliminary analysis, there's a lot of stuff to cross over is one. There's a topography issue as well that that you've got a grade change. And the way, you know, you've got the bike path, you've got that sewer easement, you've got the roadway. There's and in our program, in Kim's program, we are not using that portion of the depot site for a building or a structure. We're keeping it. So that's the buffer between the neighborhood. That's the vegetative buffer between the neighborhood to the back and the parking. And it's a pretty narrow slice anyway. And so the building would probably have to be a little peculiar and relocating parking. So I think all of those things combined make it not an obvious sort of no-brainer. And so we're sort of put that on the back burner. It's a potential solution, but I don't think we've spent a tremendous amount of capital to you know, flesh that out.
Thanks, Brett. I think it seems, let me just run through the rest of these and see if they trigger anything. And then I see there's some Q&As starting to pop up. So maybe we'll just shift over to more of that format. before we do, I don't know if anyone has feedback on question number 3, which was this balance of should the sites maintain, or should they maximize the number of units, or would a smaller scale development be more appropriate or more desirable? And I don't know if anybody had any feedback on that. And then while you're thinking about that, maybe I'll just move to the 4th question, which I know is certainly always a driver for any kind of development, which is how should the parking in town center be managed? You know, when we started the project, we certainly were given the direction that maintaining the existing parking was critical, and also then providing the required parking for whatever housing units, which would be 1 additional spot per unit. As you can see, that is one of the biggest challenges for the town center lots. So any kind of feedback that you had on parking in the town center or alternate options for maintaining public parking elsewhere would be, you know, great to hear as well. I will let everybody keep thinking about those 4 questions, but maybe we should just switch to the more open discussion format. And that way, the priority questions that you all have, we can jump onto and circle back to the others if we have time. I did see a question come into the Q&A that says, would you consider taking the 1707 building by eminent domain? Oops, I just lost it. There you go. Or consider moving the bike path over the sewer easement to max any buildable space. Those had not been considered. They're interesting ideas that had not been part of our consideration yet. The sewer easement, obviously, and the bike path, that's an interesting overlay. I do recall that the town engineer gave us some feedback about the bike path, and I don't remember right now what the challenges were with moving that, but I think that also might have its own easement. So there's definitely some administrative challenges, but it's an interesting idea. And the eminent domain is not something I probably can comment on. Carol, I don't know if you have any feedback on that.
Only to say that it would be quite a intensive process to demonstrate that there's sufficient public benefit to warrant the action, the local government action to take a property by eminent domain. There would have to be some assertions, you know, legitimate assertion that it's blighted and that the public benefit would be greater, is so great that it justifies the eminent domain. And of course, an appraisal would have to be done. And if this were pursued, a local government would, or whatever government is doing the eminent domain taking, would have to give fair market value for. It's very rarely done these days. Not out of the question, but a process exists for it, so it could be contemplated. While I have the floor, I also want to say that I would hope that everyone who's participating would give more thought to how important you think it is to have that commercial use at the ground floor on these sites. And feel free to email your thoughts on that to housingstudy@lexingtonma.gov, because though current zoning requires it for if on the properties that are in the MBTA multifamily district, there is the opportunity for what's called a friendly 40B local initiative project on properties that the select board considers a priority for affordable housing and could be asked to support. So there is that path if it was felt that we wanted to do something that didn't have commercial, if you felt that commercial was being drained away from Mass Ave or Bedford Street. So just give that some additional thought. That would be helpful. And there's no time limit. You can always email it to housingstudy@lexingtonma.gov.
I see Bob has his hand up. Sarah, could you unmute him? I think you should be able to talk now, Bob.
Well said. Good morning, and thank you very much. This is, I find it very informative with real numbers. It's nice to see that. I was just thinking about, I'm going to get the site letters wrong, but the two sites in Lexington Center, in order to make the site to the back. Okay, there we go. To make the site A more viable, maybe we could use site B for parking only, and instead of going several floors below ground level, you know how you see these parking garages with a 1 floor below or 3/4 of the floor below, so you can still see the cars, and maybe 2 levels above, just to control the costs. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but that was my first thought. I need, like everybody else, I need more time to think about this, but at least now we have the data to look at. I assume the presentation will be on the town website someplace.
That is a great question. Carol can answer that one first, and then we can chat about the other idea.
Yes, I will put the presentation as soon as LDA and Brett feel that it's tuned up. I just know that Brett probably wants to make the correction to that one, what he called his fat finger error. So we'll definitely get it on the land use, housing, and development webpage.
Yeah, and I appreciate the comment about the sharing of parking. I think that's an interesting idea, and also, you know, goals to maybe minimize the below ground parking. And I think, you know, exactly what you said was one of our first impulses too. Can we put a little bit below, a little bit above? And it just becomes a balance of, you know, how many units do we want to try and provide? Every level of parking we provide above ground is then not a level of housing. So I think it goes back a little bit to this balance we're trying to strike between maximum unit count and something more affordable to build, and you know, that uses the site appropriately. So that's, yeah, really good considerations.
Just one more thing. Just occurred to me that I don't remember what project it was, but I had cause to look at the Dock Square project in Boston, and I think they're putting, I think they put apartments above the parking. Now, I don't know how you do that with gases and fumes, but they are doing that. So you could take a look at that and see if that makes any sense.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks.
And then David, I see that you have your hand up as well.
I've got a question that hasn't been raised. Is any thought been given to whether the town's staff housing, which I think is seriously short of what it should have for efficient operation, is that a totally not considered aspect of using space, most specifically about the C site? And I'm back on my earlier comment that in my domain, I'm having difficulty getting to the financial aspects of supporting the affordable housing, and not having made a decision that whether it's between swing space or staff growth, or whether site C should just be taken off this program. Thank you.
Could I ask a clarifying question, please, David? Are you referring to whether additional departmental offices should go at 173 Bedford, or workforce housing that might include town and school staff?
I start by asking for the people that know better than I do whether there is a valid need for something other than the affordable housing, that the operation and running of the town needs some spaces. When I look at your 3 sites, the only one that came to mind at first was the out year issue of what happens to site 3 between swing space and some other staff using to make the operation of the town more efficient.
I see. Thank you for that clarification. And Kim, I'd like to try to start by just saying that it really wasn't part of the scope of the analysis when we accepted the state ARPA earmark and scoped the request for proposal that LDA responded to. It was really, is housing possible here and is it feasible? I do think, though, you're raising a good point, because I think our elected officials will want to take the study results to make some policy decisions about whether to pursue housing or some other, as you say, David, important town use on any of these sites. So thanks for underscoring that.
I see that there's another question in the Q&A about the Lot B, about partnering with the 1707 property owners to make a better option for that area. Their first for all retail would be maintained, but housing could be developed on the upper floors. Also a really interesting creative idea. I think you're seeing exactly what we're seeing there, which is that site is a real challenge unless we can somehow grow it, or pair it with something. So, Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was some discussion about reaching out to the business owners to get, their feedback and thoughts, but I don't think any kind of official decision was made to do that, right?
They were notified of these 2. They were notified that the study was going to be underway. That was in late May, I believe. And we also notified them of these 2 stakeholder meetings, but we haven't reached out to individual property owners specifically to see what they might be interested in doing.
Right. Yeah. But I think in terms of the world of opportunities and, conclusions from the study, it's definitely interesting to think about the fact that while this site might not provide in and of itself a really feasible location for housing, there is a lot of opportunity around it for, sharing resources with other people. So I think it's an interesting idea.
Definitely. Any other questions, comments?
It's a lot of information to take in. So also willing to certainly go back to any information we provided and dive in further if that would be helpful for anyone. But as Carol mentioned, sometimes just absorbing it and getting a chance to think is good. And that is why there is a second meeting as well, and that email address that Carol mentioned.
We're really giving you every chance. Also, if you have advice on or an opinion on how you think we might be able to improve the presentation when we do this again on the 26th. Of course, we welcome any comments or advice you have on that as well. And again, you can do that here, or you can do that by email to housingstudy@lexingtonma.gov.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Carol.
Here's a question.
Oh, it says Zoom chat is disabled for attendees. Okay.
Let's see if we can change that.
Oh, then all of Sarah's lovely polls have been going nowhere.
No, they've been being answered.
Oh, so they can get there. Okay, sorry.
They can't respond.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Oh, thank you for telling us.
I'm going to change this to attendees can chat with everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carol.
Okay, I apologize. Now we can try that again. I also noticed that planning board member Bob Creech has a hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, and I'm not ready right now to make a lot of comments, but keep going, because I did hear that there's a next step, and this is really useful. Again, as Mr. Pelletier mentioned, you can mix and match these things, and that requires time and analysis. So that's what I'll be looking forward to. One other comment though, at 173 Bedford Street, there's ground floor retail, but I don't know if there's a market for a lot of ground floor retail there. So the ground floor could be retail near the street, and it could be shared town space on the bottom floor. Maybe we need another bigger conference room or something like that. So there are a lot of possibilities, which I don't know makes sense financially, but there are a lot of things to consider. So my encouragement is to keep going, and I really appreciate this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. I do see a Q&A came in. The projections on housing construction costs are not just estimates, but there is a whole lot of risk given the size and duration of the potential developments. How do we manage that risk? I don't know, Brett, if you want to answer that first, or.
I'm not sure I quite understand the question, Glenn. If you're able to join the as a speaker, that might be helpful to kind of. Wonderful. There you are.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. So I guess the point is, I think you were presenting all these options in terms of costs and how it would be a net negative or positive to the town's investment in the housing. So my concern is that housing prices are somewhat volatile. Construction costs are extremely volatile right now, and we're not talking about something we can get done in a year or two even. So, if we get in on this project, what do we do if suddenly, we can't really turn this into at least a break-even proposition? So
it is incredibly rare for municipalities to develop on their own books, basically, and especially affordable housing. As soon as the town steps in the role of owner developer, a bunch of funding sources just go out the window. You just do not have access to them. And so more often than not, it is either a partnership, and it comes in a variety of flavors, but more often than not, you would see a municipality saying, hey, we have this resource in land. We have resources available potentially through CPA allocations or other municipal funding streams. We have a priority to have X done on this site, 50 units of affordable housing, and then go out to the development community, the private sector, to respond to a request for proposals or a response of interest. And that's generally the way these dispositions go. And if if you want to look at it as the town is either selling or contributing land to the affordable housing, and then the town kind of stands back and the risk is been transferred to a private developer, whether that's for profit or a nonprofit developer. It is incredibly rare to see a city or a town develop their own affordable housing. That is something that it very, very rarely happens.
Okay.
And it's just because you're, without being too glib, towns stink at it. They're just not set up for that. They're just not, it's not in their wheelhouse. They do a lot of things really well. Real estate development is not one of them. And so you find you've got resources and you've got skill sets that can go a certain way, and you find a partner that does the other stuff really well, and that's how you make an efficient.
All right. So just to follow up, I mean, to me that says, we can have these goals for the number of affordable units and the size and the relative income requirements, but once we set this in motion, all bets are off. I mean, we might not get what we were expecting.
Not necessarily. There's certainly, as long as you're a participant and these were subject to land disposition agreements and development agreements and all sorts of things that tie up the developer to do what they've said they're going to do, and what you've indicated as a priority. So there's lots of ways for the town to flex their priorities. Yeah.
Oh, that's probably the root of my question then is.
Yeah, you generally just don't give it up and say, hey, do what you can, best efforts. There is a lot of legal contracts and regulatory contracts and frameworks that would set that, would
Okay.
reduce risk to the town and kind of preserve. There's also, lots of mechanisms, if they don't deliver within X amount of years, you get the land back and you start over again, kind of thing. There are lots of opportunities to make sure you're protected.
So in that way, Brett, I guess in terms of managing the risk, the partnership with a developer kind of puts that risk more on them, right? So the town decides which site or sites, what goals for affordability, and puts out a request for a development partner, and then managing that risk moves at least partially over to that side of the team.
Yeah, and you have control as a partner, because what you're able to do is you're in charge of permitting, you're in charge of zoning, you're in charge of lots of things that you want to walk in lockstep with the developer. You don't want to just you're not just going to give it away and hope for the best. You really do have, and that's why I say it's a partnership. Even if you're not an ownership interest and at your risk, your money is at risk, you are a partner, because especially if it's a friendly 40B, you guys are going to be walking down the aisle together until this thing opens and you're toasting it. What a great project it is. So you have a lot of opportunity.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Brett. But I think it's a really exciting moment for Lexington, because now that town meeting created a housing trust and took steps to help LexHab become an independent nonprofit 501c3. Though we may see more of these opportunities, more partnerships like this, we also have in the region other nonprofit affordable housing developers, and we have developers who do mixed income affordable housing developers. There are also private developers who can do and might do an all affordable. So it's an exciting time for Lexington, and a lot of our town councils, client communities, and the RHSOs client communities have done these. So we have their experience to benefit from. So we're in a good position to I think, entertain projects like this and do it where, as Brett and Kim have said, the risk isn't on the town and we are kind of in the driver's seat. I think I fixed the chat so people can add questions to the chat, I believe. Or feel free to raise your hand as well. Okay, I guess since we don't see a lot of questions or any questions coming in the chat at this point, or hands, I guess we can say thank you so much for coming. Please do give these questions more thought, and please feel free to email your additional thoughts. I really want to thank LDA and Brett so much for this presentation, and we will get this presentation onto the website before the September 26th version of this presentation. And I know that a lot of you know how to reach me, so feel free to do that, or housingstudy@lexingtonma.gov. Thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Brett, do you